ha, 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 ha. Hello. Shalom. I am Jake Mosier, and I'm back here today to talk about some good old-fashioned American racism, but this time we are moving on to Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow is a phrase used to describe a set of laws, many laws that were made from about the years 1865, directly after the Civil War, all the way up until 1965 with the Civil Rights Act. So, what is and where does the name Jim Crow come from? Well, Jim Crow was the name of a character put on by a white comedian who the comedian would don blackface and would jump around making a fool of himself and basically just horrifically tried to make fun of black people. The name Jim Crow comes from the fact that crow is often a terrible term that racist Southerners and people would use to refer to black people. And there was a song "Jump Jim Crow," which the comedian would sing, but there was also a practice where the farmers would take bird feed, dip it in whiskey, and throw it out, and then when the crows were stumbling around drunk, they would then club them to death. So, if you look at all of those things and consider the context, it was a very, very hateful term, and that is the term that then later was applied to all of these laws. These laws were de jure. De jure segregation, meaning that it was in law, not just the fact that people were racist, but by law. So the first example is the Black Codes. Black Codes is essentially slavery by another name. It was a way to force freemen to work as servants unless they had jobs. And this is being pulled from a Hip Hughes video, which will be down in the description. Now going over to a article by History.com on the Black Codes, they say that in late 1865, Mississippi and South Carolina enacted the first Black Codes. Mississippi law required blacks to have written evidence of employment for the coming year each January. If they left before the end of the contract, they would be forced to forfeit their early wages or were subject to arrest. Now, after this arrest, they would often be taken to labor camps, where, guess, they were basically made slaves. Again, because they didn't have jobs, but in many cases they couldn't get a job, or the fact is that the white people simply wouldn't accept, oh, that doesn't count as a job because it's not blah 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 blah. They'd make up something. The fact is they just wanted more slaves. They did not care for black people. They hated them and they wanted them to be below them. Now, military Reconstruction, which was enacted after the Civil War to ensure that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were fully employed. Military Reconstruction stopped some things. However, private groups in many ways were still allowed to discriminate. It was only within the federal system that there was no discrimination. Yet in the Compromise of 1877, this all had to change. So the Republicans, according to History.com article on the Compromise of 1877, the Republicans refused to accept defeat. However, they accused Democrat supporters of intimidating and bribing African American voters to prevent them from voting. So they basically said that it doesn't count. You guys fudged the numbers. It can't be fair. So then there was a special council that was made together. 5 members of the House of Representatives, 5 of the Senate, and 5 Supreme Court justices, and they came to a conclusion, and that conclusion was that the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, will be elected. However, military Reconstruction will be over. No more of that. So basically, while they were trying to protect the rights of black people in some ways by getting a Republican into office, as Republicans were more predisposed to take care of the black people, it ended up just really hurting them, considering the fact was that now in the South, Jim Crow laws would run rampant and segregation would be everywhere, and there was nothing that they could do anymore because there was no more military there enforcing it. And then in the Civil Rights Act of 1875, just 2 years earlier than that, they said that there was no segregation in public places. So this was a law that would have been able to have been kept up. However, military Reconstruction was ended and it wasn't able to go on anymore. Furthermore, The case of Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 overturned everything. On June 7th, 1892, Plessy bought this ticket. Plessy was a mostly white man, 7/8 white man, and he got on a whites only train, which was a thing that a law that was passed in Louisiana in 1890. He got on that train and he told the conductor, "I'm an eighth black," but he had to tell him because the man was so white that no one could tell. And then eventually, the conductor said, "I want you off this train," and he said no. So he pulled a Rosa Parks before Rosa Parks was a thing, and eventually he was arrested and jailed. Then, in the final decision, the Supreme Court in 1896 said that separate but equal is perfectly fine as long as there is a separate but equal accommodation for a black person. Segregation's fine as long as we give them their own thing. So separate water fountains, separate benches, separate parks, separate schools, separate everything. And we all know that that just doesn't work. There's no such thing as separate but equal. If they're separate, then they're inherently going to be different. If they weren't, there wouldn't be no separation because they'd be the same. So by nature, separate but equal cannot be equal. However, America was exceptionally racist, and we just passed the decision anyways. So, going on, some other examples of Jim Crow laws are the voting laws, such as poll taxes, which would keep it so that black people couldn't vote, literacy tests, which would keep it so black people couldn't vote, grandfather clauses, which would help the poor and uneducated white people who wanted to vote, because even though they couldn't pay the poll taxes or they couldn't pass the literacy tests, if they could prove that their grandfather voted or a relative voted, then they themselves have the right to vote. However, since black people were all enslaved, it was impossible for their grandfather to have voted, considering he was a slave, if anything. So it was impossible for them to prove their right to vote. A more recent example, by recent I'm talking mid-1900s, Woodrow Wilson created the segregated army and segregated the federal staff in Washington, D.C. Not exactly a great decision, not exactly a great thing to happen. And all of this continued, and these laws such as separating people in water fountains, buses, everything continued up until the Civil Rights Act of 1965. That's over 100 years after the Civil War ended, after the 15th Amendment was adopted, saying that all black people are citizens, and all citizens have rights, and all citizens can vote. Didn't matter. Equal protection didn't exist. Rather, we took advantage of these people. We didn't care as a society, and it took over 100 years, after already taking 250 years to reverse racism. Well, reverse slavery. Not exactly a great 350 era of United States history. And we're not even 100 years out of that yet. 1965 wasn't that long ago. My dad was born in 1965. So, my question that I'm pondering now is, what is it that 100 years from today, we're going to look back and say, how did we let that go? How were we so blind? How could they do that? That's so evil. I just pray that we will find that out. I pray that when our grandchildren look back at us, they wouldn't have to shun and shiver at what their ancestors did. So, consider what you do. Consider your actions. Consider how they affect the people around you. And I'll see you soon.